Tuesday morning. Then 3 HOA officers showed up at my door. They said I violated a pressure washing rule. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, whispering. I stayed calm and asked for proof. One officer's hands started shaking. Something about their story didn't add up. 10 minutes later, sirens were coming down my street. My name is Elena Cruz, and I've lived in Maplewood Ridge for 6 years with my 12-year-old son, Mateo, since my divorce. I work as a paralegal downtown, and I chose this neighborhood because the schools were good and the streets felt safe. I never imagined a driveway would nearly cost me my home. Our house was modest but mine, paid for with years of overtime and careful budgeting. I kept the lawn trimmed, the mailbox painted, and I paid my HOA dues on time every single month. I wanted peace, not attention. Peace was the last thing Maplewood Ridge would give me. The trouble started small, the way these things always do. Deborah Sinclair had been HOA president for 3 years, and everyone called her Debbie, though never to her face without a title attached. She walked the neighborhood each morning with a clipboard, noting anything that offended her sense of order. Debbie's own house sat at the top of the cul-de-sac. White pillars, a fountain, hedges trimmed into perfect cubes. People said she'd once made a family repaint their door because the shade of blue was too aggressive. I laughed about it back then. I didn't know I'd become her next project. I first met her properly at a community potluck, where she introduced herself by listing her HOA credentials before her own name. She asked what I did for work, and when I said paralegal, her smile tightened slightly. How useful, she said. For reading contracts you didn't write. At the time I thought nothing of it. Small talk, nervous energy, nothing more. But Debbie remembered things. She filed away details about neighbors the way other people collected recipes. And she always found a use for them eventually, usually when it benefited her position. My son Mateo loved riding his bike past her house because of the fountain. And one afternoon Debbie stopped him to ask why his helmet strap was improperly fastened. He came home rattled, asking if he'd get in trouble. I told him no. Word around the neighborhood was that Debbie's husband, Roger, owned a landscaping and pressure washing company that somehow always seemed to get hired for HOA projects. Nobody asked questions out loud. Bidding processes existed on paper, but everyone quietly understood who would win. I noticed Roger's truck idling outside my house one Sunday, though I hadn't called anyone. When I asked what he needed, he said Debbie had asked him to take a look at my driveway staining. I hadn't reported any staining. I hadn't asked for a look either. A week later, an official-looking notice appeared in my mailbox, citing unsightly discoloration on my concrete driveway and giving me 30 days to remedy it or face escalating fines. I checked my driveway. 6 years. Maybe a little weathered. I called the HOA office to ask who filed the complaint, but the woman on the phone said complaint sources were confidential per bylaws. I found that strange. Since our community newsletter usually printed violation photos with addresses attached for transparency, as Debbie liked to call it, I decided not to make it a fight. I hired a local pressure washing service, not Roger's company, and had my driveway cleaned within the week. I sent photos to the HOA office as proof of compliance, thinking that would be the end of it. It was only the beginning. 3 days after I submitted my compliance photos, I received a second notice claiming the cleaning was inadequate and that a licensed contractor needed to reassess the surface. The only licensed contractor listed on the approved vendor sheet was, unsurprisingly, Sinclair Landscaping and Pressure Solutions. I mentioned this to my neighbor, Priya, who'd lived on the street even longer than I had. She lowered her voice and told me 2 other families had gone through the exact same pattern last year. Vague violation, private inspection request, then a bill from Roger's company. Priya said both families eventually paid just to make it stop. One had even sold their house afterward, exhausted by the constant scrutiny. She warned me gently, "Debbie doesn't like when people push back. She likes it even less when they win." I told her I wasn't planning to lose. I requested, in writing, the specific HOA bylaw section describing acceptable driveway condition, along with the original complaint documentation. The office responded that board discretion governed aesthetic violations, and no further documentation was required. That answer, as a paralegal, told me exactly how flimsy their case really was. I started keeping a folder. Every notice, every email, every photo, time-stamped and organized the way I'd learned to organize discovery documents at work. I didn't know yet how important that folder would become, only that something about this situation felt deliberately engineered against me. At the next HOA meeting, I raised my hand and asked publicly about the vendor approval process and whether board members' family businesses should be excluded from bidding. The room went quiet, but her knuckles went white around her gavel. She answered smoothly, saying all vendors were vetted through proper channels, and implying my question sounded like an accusation rather than a concern. Several neighbors avoided my eyes afterward in the parking lot, the way people avoid someone they secretly agree with but are too afraid to stand beside. 2 days later, a new fine appeared on my account, $200 for unauthorized use of a non-approved pressure washing vendor. I hadn't been informed such a rule existed until that exact charge appeared. I paid it under protest, in writing, and kept the receipt. Nadia, the HOA board secretary, called me privately that same week. She sounded nervous, choosing her words carefully, and asked if I had documentation of everything happening to me. I said yes. Good. Keep collecting it, and hung up before I could ask why. I didn't understand Nadia's warning yet, but something about her tone stuck with me for days. It wasn't fear of Debbie exactly. It was closer to guilt, like someone standing near a fire they hadn't started but had watched burn for far too long without saying anything. Meanwhile, Mateo told me kids at the bus stop had started calling our house the Violation House, a nickname clearly seeded by adults, not children. I realized then this wasn't only about a driveway anymore. Debbie was building a narrative, and I was becoming the neighborhood's cautionary tale. The real spark came on a Saturday morning when Roger's truck parked directly across my driveway without permission, blocking me from leaving for Mateo's soccer game. I asked him politely to move it. He said Debbie authorized routine inspection access, and I should check my email. My email held no such authorization, only a generic newsletter about lawn heights. I called the local non-emergency police line, since the stranger's truck was blocking my property without consent. Roger moved the truck before officers arrived, smirking the entire time like he'd already won something. That afternoon, an emergency notice appeared taped to my door, citing me for obstructing a scheduled HOA maintenance inspection. I hadn't obstructed anything. I'd simply needed to leave for my son's game. The notice threatened a lien on my property if the pattern continued. I photographed the notice before removing it, adding it to my growing folder. My hands shook slightly as I did, not from fear exactly, but from disbelief that someone could weaponize paperwork this casually against a neighbor who'd done nothing but ask reasonable questions. At Mateo's game, another HOA family, the Chens, quietly told me they'd received a similar obstruction notice 2 years prior, right after Mrs. Chun questioned a landscaping contract. They'd paid the fine rather than fight it, assuming resistance would only invite worse treatment from the board. I started noticing Debbie's car slow rolling past my house more frequently, sometimes twice a day. She never waved. The way an inspector looks at something they intend to condemn. Mateo asked why the fountain lady kept driving by. I didn't have a comforting answer. I contacted a local attorney friend, Marcus, who specialized in community association law, and described everything. He said HOA boards had real power but not unlimited power, and vendor conflicts of interest combined with retaliatory fines could constitute a legitimate legal case if properly documented. Marcus advised me to keep responding calmly and in writing, never in person, and never alone. He said boards like Debbie's often relied on intimidation and social pressure rather than actual legal standing, betting that most homeowners would simply pay to avoid conflict. I decided not to be most homeowners. The following week, I received a formal letter announcing a special inspection of my property scheduled without my consent, citing a clause about board access in cases of repeated noncompliance. I called Marcus immediately. He said no such blanket access clause existed in standard HOA bylaws he'd reviewed. I requested a copy of Maplewood Ridge's actual governing bylaws from the county recorder's office rather than the HOA office, since public filings couldn't be selectively edited the way internal documents apparently could. What I found didn't match a single citation on any notice Debbie had sent me. The recorded bylaws required a documented complaint, board vote, and 72-hour written notice before any inspection could occur, none of which had happened in my case. I now had official proof that Debbie's notices weren't just aggressive. They were procedurally invalid from the very beginning. I didn't confront her yet, saying premature confrontation would only let her adjust her tactics. Instead, I quietly requested the full HOA financial ledger for the past 2 years, citing my right as a dues-paying member under state disclosure law. The office stalled for weeks. While waiting, I learned from Priya that Nadia, the secretary, had recently stopped attending closed board sessions, citing scheduling conflicts that seemed to align suspiciously with topics involving vendor contracts. Priya suspected Nadia was distancing herself deliberately, perhaps preparing for something neither of us understood yet. One evening, Nadia showed up at my door unannounced, glancing over her shoulder before stepping inside. She said she couldn't keep watching what was happening, and that Debbie had been steering contracts to Roger's company for nearly 4 years, far longer than anyone suspected. Nadia revealed she'd seen internal spreadsheets showing markups on landscaping invoices that didn't match the actual work performed, sometimes by thousands of dollars per project. She hadn't reported it because Debbie controlled her HOA volunteer stipend, one of the only income sources Nadia had during a rough year. I told Nadia I understood, and that nobody would blame her for surviving her own circumstances. What mattered now, I said, was documenting the truth carefully enough that it couldn't be dismissed as a personal grudge between two women who simply disliked each other over a driveway. Nadia agreed to quietly photograph, select financial records during her next office visit, without altering or removing anything, just documenting what already existed. It felt like assembling pieces of a puzzle none of us had asked to solve. Yet all of us were now responsible for finishing. 2 days later, my HOA account showed a new lien filing for unpaid violation balances, despite every fine having been paid and receipted. I called the office, and the clerk, sounding uncomfortable, said the lien request had come directly from President Sinclair's office, bypassing normal review procedure. Marcus said a wrongful lien filing was a serious escalation, potentially actionable on its own, since it could damage my credit and complicate any future refinancing or sale of my home. He suggested I send a formal cease and desist letter while continuing to quietly gather evidence in parallel. I sent the letter by certified mail, keeping a copy for my folder, which now filled an entire accordion binder. Debbie didn't respond directly. Instead, the next community newsletter featured a section titled, "Know Your Neighbor," subtly implying certain homeowners were difficult and resistant to community standards. Everyone in the neighborhood knew who the article meant, even without my name printed. Mateo came home upset because a classmate's parent had mentioned it at pickup. I hugged him and promised things would be fine, even though, privately, I wasn't entirely sure I believed it yet myself. The lien filing triggered something I hadn't anticipated. My mortgage lender flagged my account for review, since liens can complicate loan standing. I spent an entire lunch break on hold with my bank, explaining a dispute that wasn't even legitimate, feeling my carefully built financial stability wobble. I filed a formal written dispute with the county, attaching the actual recorded bylaws proving the HOA's notice procedures had been violated from the start. The county clerk noted my dispute but said resolution could take months, since HOA-related liens rarely received priority review. Debbie, apparently sensing resistance, escalated further by sending a letter to my employer's HR department, claiming I'd been harassing HOA volunteers and questioning my professional judgment as a paralegal. My supervisor called me into her office, confused, holding the printed letter like evidence in a trial. I explained the entire situation calmly, showing my documentation folder, and my supervisor, to her credit, recognized retaliatory behavior when she saw it. She told me the firm supported me fully, but the fact Debbie had gone after my livelihood revealed how far she was willing to go. That night, couldn't sleep. Not from fear of losing, but from disbelief at the sheer effort someone was investing to punish me over a driveway. Marcus reminded me that people like Debbie rarely stopped at proportional response. Control, once challenged, became personal in ways facts couldn't touch. Priya told me another neighbor, Mr. Alvarez, had quietly begun recording his own interactions with Debbie after a dispute over his mailbox post height. He'd learned the hard way that verbal promises from the board meant nothing once written notices started arriving contradicting earlier conversations. I reached out to Mr. He agreed to share his recordings if things escalated to a formal hearing. Slowly, without any of us planning it deliberately, a quiet network of neighbors began comparing notes, realizing Debbie's pattern extended far beyond just my driveway complaint. At the next board meeting, I requested the financial ledger again, this time citing my written dispute and county filing as leverage. Debbie announced the meeting was closing early due to technical difficulties the moment I stood to speak, though the microphone system worked fine for everyone else. Nadia later texted me that Debbie had specifically instructed the treasurer to delay any ledger release until after the fiscal year closed, using vague language about audit preparation to justify the stall. It felt less like bureaucracy now and more like someone actively hiding a trail. I filed a formal state complaint with the Community Association Regulatory Division, attaching my binder of evidence, invalid notices, the improper lien, the HR letter, and the conflicting bylaw citations. Felt strange sending it, like lighting a fuse I couldn't fully predict the outcome of. Within a week, the Regulatory Division sent Maplewood Ridge HOA a formal inquiry letter, requesting documentation justifying the fines and lien against my property. For the first time since this began, I saw something shift in the neighborhood's usual quiet compliance around Debbie's decisions. Priya said Debbie had been overheard at the community mailboxes calling me litigious and ungrateful, insisting she was simply protecting property values. Some neighbors nodded along out of habit, but others, quietly, started asking their own questions about vendor contracts for the first time. Roger's truck appeared outside my house again, this time at nearly 10 at night, engine idling with headlights aimed directly at my front windows. I called the police, who arrived and noted the report, though Roger claimed he was simply checking landscaping equipment left in the area. The officer privately told me, off record, that this was the third late-night disturbance call linked to Roger's vehicle near HOA disputed properties that year. It wasn't proof of anything criminal yet, but it confirmed a pattern extending well beyond my own personal experience with the family. I installed a doorbell camera the next morning, along with 2 additional cameras covering my driveway and side gate, something I should have done weeks earlier. Marcus said documented footage would strengthen my case significantly if intimidation escalated further, which, based on the pattern, seemed increasingly likely. 2 nights later, my new camera captured Debbie herself walking up my driveway around midnight, photographing something near my trash bins before quickly leaving. I hadn't authorized any inspection, and midnight certainly wasn't within any reasonable hours listed in the actual recorded bylaws I now knew well. I sent the footage to Marcus immediately, and he said this alone could support a harassment complaint independent of the HOA dispute entirely. It was strange watching someone I once considered merely irritating transform, clip by clip, into something closer to a genuine threat to my family. Nadia messaged me the next morning saying Debbie had called an emergency closed-door session, allegedly to discuss a security concern involving my property, framing herself as the victim of surveillance rather than the person caught trespassing on someone else's driveway after midnight. I decided it was time to speak with a few trusted neighbors openly rather than quietly. I invited Priya, Mr. Alvarez, and the Chens over for coffee, laying out everything I'd gathered. Their faces shifted from sympathy to something sharper, recognition that this had never just been about me. Mr. His own recordings, revealing Debbie had once promised him verbally that a fence exception was approved, only to fine him weeks later for the very same fence, claiming no exception existed. The pattern was unmistakable now. Promise, deny, fine, repeat, across multiple households. The Chens admitted they'd nearly sold their house the previous year rather than continue dealing with Debbie's escalating demands, only staying because their daughter didn't want to change schools mid-year. Hearing that I realized how much quiet suffering had been absorbed silently across this neighborhood. We agreed to formally request an independent financial audit of the HOA. Using our combined signatures as dues-paying members, a right guaranteed under state association law that Debbie had clearly never expected multiple households to exercise simultaneously and publicly, rather than isolated and afraid. Debbie responded within days with a mass email accusing a small disgruntled faction of spreading misinformation to damage community harmony, warning that legal action against defamation would be pursued if false claims continued circulating among residents of Maplewood Ridge. The email backfired. Spoken up before quietly reached out to me, sharing their own stories of confusing fines, sudden liens, or pressure to hire Rogers Company for minor repairs they'd never actually requested in the first place. Priya suggested we create a shared document, encrypted and access limited, where residents could log their own experiences with dates and evidence. Within a week, 14 households had contributed entries, forming a timeline eerily consistent with Nadia's private financial spreadsheets from inside the office. Marcus reviewed the shared timeline and said the pattern now resembled organizational racketeering more than simple mismanagement,
since it involved deliberate financial benefit funneled through Rogers Company combined with retaliation against anyone who questioned the arrangement publicly or in writing.
I felt a strange mixture of vindication and exhaustion. Part of me wanted this to simply end quietly with an apology and a canceled lien. Another part, the paralegal part, understood that quiet endings rarely happened for people like Debbie unless forced by undeniable documented consequences. Debbie, apparently sensing the shifting tide, requested a private meeting with me alone at the HOA office, without board witnesses present. Marcus advised against attending without a third party, warning that private meetings with no record could easily become another distorted narrative used against me. I declined the private meeting but offered a recorded call instead, citing transparency concerns given recent events. Debbie refused, insisting recorded conversations violated trust between neighbors, a phrase that felt almost laughable considering midnight driveway photography and unauthorized liens filed against my home. Instead, she escalated by hiring an outside compliance consultant, conveniently a cousin of Rogers, to conduct a full property review of my house, citing ongoing community concerns as justification. The review letter arrived demanding access within 48 hours or facing an automatic maximum fine. Marcus said forced entry demands without a proper board vote and documented complaint violated both the recorded bylaws and basic property rights under state law. He drafted a formal legal response denying access and formally notifying the HOA that any unauthorized entry would result in immediate legal action. For a short stretch, things went quiet. No new notices, no late-night visits, no emails. I almost let myself believe the pressure had worked, that Debbie had recalculated the cost of continuing this fight against a resident who now had documentation, allies, and legal counsel behind her. Mateo's soccer season ended with a small trophy ceremony, and for one Saturday afternoon, life felt almost normal again. Neighbors who'd stayed quiet before started greeting me warmly at practice, some quietly thanking me for asking questions they'd been too afraid to raise themselves for years. Priya warned me not to relax too fully, saying Debbie's silences historically preceded her biggest moves, not her surrenders. I appreciated the warning but allowed myself a few days of cautious peace anyway, knowing exhaustion had been building in me since the very first false notice arrived. The Regulatory Division's inquiry letter apparently reached Debbie's desk during this quiet stretch, though none of us knew the exact contents yet. Nadia mentioned Debbie had been unusually short-tempered in the office that week, snapping at staff over minor scheduling issues that normally wouldn't bother her. I used the calm period to organize my binder further, cross-referencing dates, photographs, and financial figures into a clean chronological narrative, the way I'd prepare exhibits for a case at work. Marcus reviewed it and said it read like a textbook pattern of retaliatory HOA governance. The Chens invited several families over for a low-key backyard gathering. Less celebration and more quiet solidarity among people who'd each individually assumed they were alone in their frustrations. Hearing everyone's stories together painted a fuller picture than any single household could have shown alone. Mr. and that his cousin, a local news producer, had once covered a similar HOA corruption story in another county and offered to make an introduction if things ever became public enough to warrant coverage. I thanked him but hoped, honestly, it wouldn't reach that point. Nadia grew increasingly anxious during this stretch, worried her earlier photographs of the financial spreadsheets might be discovered if Debbie conducted an internal audit preemptively. I reassured her that Marcus had structured everything to protect her identity as a source unless she chose otherwise. I noticed Debbie's car no longer slow-rolling past my house during this quiet week, which felt less comforting than I expected. Predators go quiet before they strike, Priya had said once, half joking. I started double-checking my camera footage each morning out of quiet, persistent unease. Marcus received a formal letter from the HOA's attorney, oddly generic in tone, denying any wrongdoing while offering to waive my lien if I signed a non-disclosure agreement preventing future public discussion of the matter. It felt less like resolution and more like a bribe wrapped in legal language. I refused the offer without hesitation. Signing away my right to speak would have protected Debbie far more than it protected me. And it would have abandoned every neighbor who'd trusted me with their own quiet stories of fines, and forced compliance over the years. Marcus sent a firm written refusal, noting that any further retaliation following this rejection would be treated as evidence of bad faith in any future proceeding. The quiet period, was ending exactly the way Priya predicted, right on schedule, right before something bigger began. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived announcing an emergency board vote scheduled to consider foreclosure proceedings against my property for unpaid violation balances. Despite every single fine having been formally disputed and legally frozen pending the ongoing regulatory investigation into the HOA itself. I read the letter twice, hands trembling slightly, unable to fully believe Debbie would escalate this far over what had started as a supposedly discolored driveway. Marcus confirmed foreclosure threats over disputed, unpaid HOA fines were extremely aggressive and, in our case, procedurally baseless entirely. Word of the emergency vote spread quickly through our shared resident document. And to my surprise, 6 additional households requested to attend the meeting in solidarity, wanting to witness firsthand whatever justification Debbie planned to offer for such a drastic and clearly retaliatory action. The meeting room was fuller than I'd ever seen it, folding chairs added along the back wall. Debbie stood at the podium, visibly annoyed by the turnout, adjusting her notes twice before beginning with a speech about protecting community standards from repeated noncompliance. When my turn came to speak, I calmly presented the county's recorded bylaws, my certified dispute filings, and the regulatory division's open inquiry letter, showing point by point how every procedural requirement had been ignored or fabricated throughout this entire 8-month ordeal against my household. Several neighbors gasped audibly when I read aloud the exact bylaw section requiring board votes and 72-hour notice before any inspection. Since Debbie had cited non-existent authority so confidently for months that most residents assumed her claims carried real legal weight all along. Debbie interrupted repeatedly, insisting my presentation was theatrical and designed to embarrass volunteers who sacrificed their time for the community. Her voice rose slightly, an unfamiliar crack in her usually composed tone, as more neighbors exchanged uncertain glances across the crowded room. The board treasurer, visibly uncomfortable, requested a recess before voting, citing a need to review documentation properly. Debbie objected sharply, insisting the vote proceed immediately, a level of urgency that struck several attendees as strange for a routine community foreclosure matter. The recess was granted anyway, overruling Debbie by a narrow board majority for the first time anyone could remember. In the hallway outside, Priya whispered that she'd never seen Debbie lose control of a room like that, not once in 3 years of meetings. During the recess, Nadia approached me quietly, whispering that she could no longer stay silent about the financial spreadsheets, especially now that foreclosure was being threatened over fabricated violations. She said she wanted to present her documentation formally once the meeting resumed. When the meeting reconvened, Nadia requested the floor before any vote, stating she had financial records raising serious concerns about vendor contracts approved without proper competitive bidding. Debbie's expression hardened instantly, her earlier composure completely replaced by something closer to controlled panic. Nadia displayed printed spreadsheets showing invoices from Sinclair Landscaping consistently priced 20 to 40% above comparable vendor quotes obtained independently,
spanning nearly 4 years of continuous, uncontested HOA contracts approved solely under Debbie's direct signature authority as president.
The room fell into stunned murmurs as neighbors realized the scale of what had likely been happening for years, quietly funded through their own monthly dues, disguised behind vague line items labeled landscaping services and community maintenance improvements on annual budget summaries. Debbie accused Nadia of fabricating documents out of personal resentment, claiming she'd been passed over for a paid coordinator position the previous year. Nadia calmly replied that the documents were pulled directly from HOA office files, not personal opinion, and could be verified against bank records. The board treasurer, pale-faced, admitted quietly that she'd questioned some invoice discrepancies privately before, but had been told by Debbie that vendor pricing was confidential business information, not subject to board-level scrutiny, a statement several members now recognized as clearly improper. I asked, calmly and publicly, whether the board had any records showing competitive bids had ever actually been solicited for Sinclair Landscaping contracts, or whether Rogers' company had simply been awarded work directly each time without comparison against other qualified vendors in the area. Silence answered my question more clearly than words could have. No one produced bidding records, because, as we later confirmed, none had ever existed. Every contract had been awarded directly, quietly, consistently, funneling community funds into Debbie's own household for nearly half a decade uninterrupted. The foreclosure vote was tabled indefinitely by unanimous board decision, a stunning reversal from where the meeting had begun less than an hour earlier. Debbie stood rigidly at the podium, gripping her notes, as murmurs around the room slowly transformed into open, unguarded anger. Mr. and asked publicly how many other residents had paid fines or liens tied to disputes that conveniently benefited Sinclair Landscaping's business. wondering aloud whether my situation had ever truly been about driveway staining at all, or something far more calculated. Debbie attempted to regain control of the meeting, insisting these were unverified allegations, requiring proper investigation before any conclusions. Ironically, the exact due process she had denied me for 8 consecutive months throughout this entire fabricated violation ordeal against my family. The board voted to suspend Debbie's signature authority over vendor contracts pending a full independent audit, a procedural move that stripped away the mechanism she'd used to control both HOA finances and, indirectly, the fear that had kept most residents quietly compliant for years. Leaving the meeting that night, several neighbors thanked me quietly, some tearfully, admitting they'd assumed challenging the board was simply impossible without risking their own homes. For the first time in 8 months, I drove home feeling something closer to hope than exhaustion. The relief didn't last long. 2 days later, my car's tires were slashed overnight, all for discovered when I stepped outside for work. My driveway camera had unfortunately been repositioned during a windstorm days earlier and had captured nothing usable from that particular angle. I filed a police report immediately, though without clear footage. Officers said proving intent or identity would be difficult. Still, given the ongoing HOA dispute, the responding officer noted the incident in connection with prior calls involving Roger's vehicle near my property over recent months. Marcus said escalating property damage, even without direct proof of who caused it, strengthened our overall pattern of harassment argument significantly, especially combined with the midnight trespassing footage and repeated retaliatory fines already documented extensively throughout my growing evidentiary binder from the past 8 months. Priya, shaken by the tire incident, offered to install additional shared cameras covering the shared cul-de-sac area, angled to capture more of the street beyond just individual driveways. Several neighbors quietly agreed, understanding now that this had become a community safety concern, not simply my dispute alone. Debbie, meanwhile, issued a public statement blaming unrelated neighborhood vandalism for my slashed tires, subtly implying I might have staged the incident. Myself for sympathy, a claim that struck even her remaining supporters as increasingly desperate rather than genuinely persuasive to reasonable people. Roger was seen the following week loudly complaining at the local hardware store that some people just can't accept consequences, a comment overheard by another resident who happened to be Priya's coworker, who reported it back almost immediately through our shared community group chat. The independent financial audit, ordered by the board, began within the week, led by an outside accountant unaffiliated with Maplewood Ridge entirely. Nadia provided full access to her previously photographed records, along with additional invoices she'd carefully preserved throughout her years working inside the office. The auditor's preliminary findings, shared informally with select board members, suggested nearly $180,000 in inflated landscaping. Invoices over 4 years, funneled almost entirely through Sinclair Landscaping and Pressure Solutions under Debbie's direct, uncontested contract approval authority. Debbie requested the audit be paused, citing procedural irregularities in how it was authorized without full board consent, though records showed she herself had approved similar emergency spending measures without full consent numerous times whenever it benefited her own initiatives previously. The board denied her pause request by a widening majority vote, several members now openly questioning decisions they'd rubber-stamped for years without deeper scrutiny. Emboldened by growing resident pressure and the undeniable weight of documented financial discrepancies uncovered so far in the audit, I received an anonymous letter in my mailbox and signed, warning me to drop this before it gets worse for your family. Marcus said anonymous threats, especially timed alongside an active audit implicating someone specific, constituted a serious escalation warranting direct police involvement immediately. The responding detective this time took the situation more seriously, connecting the anonymous letter with the earlier tire slashing and trespassing footage into a formal pattern of harassment case file, opening an active investigation separate from, but closely related to, the ongoing HOA financial audit. Nadia confided that Debbie had grown increasingly erratic in the office, snapping at staff, canceling meetings abruptly, and once being overheard on a phone call insisting, "This will all disappear once people move on to something else." A chilling comment given recent events. Priya suggested reaching out to Mr. Alvarez's news producer cousin now. Given the mounting evidence of both financial misconduct and personal intimidation tactics, I hesitated, still hoping resolution could happen quietly through proper channels rather than public exposure. Though that hope was fading quickly, the auditor's final report confirmed the preliminary findings, detailing systematic overbilling, missing competitive bid documentation, and several invoices for work that inspection photos suggested had never actually been performed at all, despite full payment being issued from HOA Community Reserve funds. The board scheduled an emergency vote to formally remove Debbie from her position as president, pending further review by both HOA legal counsel and, potentially, local law enforcement given the scale of financial discrepancies uncovered throughout the 4-year audit period now fully documented. Debbie requested to address the board privately before any removal vote, and was granted 15 minutes, during which she reportedly offered to personally repay a portion of the discrepancies if the matter could be handled quietly, without involving outside legal or law enforcement agencies. The board declined her offer, citing fiduciary duty to all dues-paying residents who deserved full transparency, not a quiet private settlement designed primarily to protect one individual from consequences that hundreds of families had unknowingly funded through years of inflated community expenses. Debbie was formally removed from the HOA presidency that same night by unanimous board vote, though she remained a general HOA member, retaining voting rights but losing all administrative authority over contracts, notices, fines, or any future disciplinary actions against fellow residents entirely. I expected, naively, that removal from leadership might finally end the harassment against my family. Instead, stripped of official authority, Debbie seemed to grow more reckless, no longer constrained by even the pretense of procedural legitimacy she'd previously hidden behind for years. 2 nights after her removal, my home's exterior lights were smashed with what appeared to be a blunt object, caught partially on Priya's newly installed shared street camera, though the footage angle obscured the person's face beneath a dark hooded jacket in poor lighting. The detective assigned to my case said the timing, immediately following Debbie's public removal, was significant, though not yet conclusive proof of her direct involvement without clearer identification from available footage across multiple neighborhood cameras positioned throughout the surrounding cul-de-sac area. Roger was questioned briefly by police regarding his whereabouts that night, providing an alibi that Debbie herself corroborated, claiming he'd been home with her the entire evening, a claim neither could independently prove beyond their own mutual, increasingly convenient testimony to investigators. I began keeping Mateo with a trusted family friend on nights I worked late, unwilling to risk his safety while this situation remained unresolved and increasingly unpredictable. He didn't fully understand why Only that Mom seemed more tired and more careful than usual lately. Marcus filed a formal request for a restraining order against Debbie and Roger jointly, citing the documented pattern of trespassing, property damage, anonymous threats, and repeated retaliatory conduct spanning nearly a full year since the very first improper driveway violation notice arrived. A preliminary hearing date was set for the restraining order request, giving both sides 2 weeks to prepare formal statements and evidence. Debbie hired a private attorney, distinct from the HOA's counsel, signaling she understood this had moved well beyond community association disputes now. In those 2 weeks, Debbie's behavior grew visibly more desperate. She began appearing uninvited at neighborhood driveways, insisting residents sign statements claiming I had fabricated or exaggerated my complaints, an attempt several families later described as feeling less like persuasion and more like coercion. Mr. used outright, telling her directly that he'd already shared his own recordings with Marcus and had no intention of contradicting documented truth to protect someone who'd fined him over a fence exception she'd personally approved and later denied ever discussing. The Chens reported Debbie showed up at their home around 9 at night, agitated, asking pointed questions about who else in the neighborhood had been talking to reporters, a comment that suggested she somehow already suspected Mr. Alvarez's earlier offer to involve local news coverage. Priya's shared street camera captured Debbie's car, circling the cul-de-sac 4 separate times over a single evening, slowing noticeably each pass near my house, behavior the detective noted as consistent with continued surveillance despite the pending restraining order hearing scheduled just days away. I stopped sleeping well entirely during this stretch, checking camera footage compulsively each morning before Mateo woke for school. Marcus reminded me gently that documented escalation, however exhausting to endure personally, was strengthening our legal position significantly heading into the upcoming hearing. Nadia, now cooperating fully and openly with both the audit team and local investigators, revealed something new: financial records suggesting Debbie had personally forged 2 board members' signatures on contract approval documents years earlier, when the original board had actually voted against hiring Roger's company. This revelation meant Debbie hadn't simply exploited a compliant board over the years. She had actively falsified official HOA records to override a legitimate rejection of her husband's company, a discovery that transformed the case from financial mismanagement into potential outright document fraud. Marcus immediately incorporated this new evidence into both the restraining order filing and a separate formal complaint submitted to the State Regulatory Division,
arguing the forged signatures demonstrated clear premeditated intent rather than simple negligent oversight of community association responsibilities.
Roger, questioned again by detectives regarding the forged signature allegations, grew visibly agitated during the interview according to the responding officer's report, repeatedly insisting he had nothing to do with paperwork, a statement that, notably, didn't actually deny Debbie's involvement at all. Debbie's private attorney reportedly advised her strongly against further public appearances or confrontations pending the hearing, advice she seemingly ignored entirely when she showed up uninvited at the county recorder's office, attempting to request removal of certain HOA filings from public record access. The county clerk, familiar with proper procedure, refused her request outright, explaining that publicly recorded documents couldn't simply be removed on demand, especially ones actively under review as part of an ongoing fraud and financial misconduct investigation involving multiple government agencies. That same week, Mateo came home upset after Debbie approached him directly near the school bus stop, asking pointed questions about whether Mommy talks about the lawsuit at home. I immediately reported this to both Marcus and the detective, given Mateo's age and clear vulnerability. The detective confirmed this incident alone could constitute grounds for an emergency temporary restraining order, given the direct contact with a minor child despite an already pending formal hearing specifically addressing harassment concerns against our entire household over the past several months. A judge granted the emergency temporary order within 48 hours, legally barring Debbie and Roger from approaching our property, contacting Mateo directly, or engaging with our household in any capacity outside formal legal proceedings until the full hearing could be properly conducted. Debbie's reaction to the temporary order, according to neighbors, was explosive. She was reportedly seen shouting at her own attorney in her driveway, loudly insisting the entire situation was a coordinated conspiracy, designed specifically to destroy her reputation and strip away everything she'd built. Roger, meanwhile, quietly listed Sinclair Landscaping's business assets for sale online, a move Marcus flagged immediately as a potential attempt to shield finances from the growing financial misconduct investigation before any formal restitution or penalties could be legally assessed against the company. The detective obtained a court order freezing the business's assets pending investigation completion, preventing any sale or asset transfer until the full scope of overbilled HOA funds and forged contract documentation could be properly accounted for through ongoing forensic financial review. I felt the walls closing in around Debbie now, not through anything dramatic on my part, but simply through the slow, methodical accumulation of documented truth that people like her always seemed to assume would never actually catch up with them eventually. Nadia mentioned Debbie had begun making frantic late-night calls to remaining board members, alternating between tearful apologies and thinly veiled threats about consequences for anyone who continued cooperating with investigators against her, a shift several members found deeply unsettling to witness firsthand. One board member, previously silent throughout the entire ordeal, finally came forward admitting Debbie had once told her privately that difficult residents eventually give up or move away, treating years of intimidation as simply an effective, if unspoken, community management strategy she'd relied upon. The restraining order hearing date arrived faster than expected, moved up given the emergency order already in place and the seriousness of contact made directly with a minor child.
I sat beside Marcus,
Binder in hand, feeling strangely calm after nearly a year of turmoil. Debbie arrived with her private attorney, visibly thinner than before, her usual composed presentation replaced by something tighter, more guarded. Roger sat beside her, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the courtroom, including his own wife throughout most of the proceeding that morning. Marcus presented our evidence methodically, the invalid violation notices, the improper lien, the midnight trespassing footage, the tire slashing report, the anonymous threat letter, and finally, the direct contact with Mateo at the bus stop despite clear awareness of ongoing legal proceedings. Debbie's attorney attempted to argue the evidence represented isolated incidents rather than a coordinated pattern, but the judge, reviewing the timeline chronologically, noted aloud that isolated incidents rarely escalated with such consistent, personal specificity over nearly 12 continuous months without pause. When questioned directly about the forged board signatures uncovered during the financial audit, Debbie's composure finally cracked entirely. She insisted she'd only ever done what was best for the community, her voice rising sharply before her attorney quietly urged her to stop speaking further. The judge granted a full, extended restraining order against both Debbie and Roger, citing clear, sustained evidence of harassment, intimidation, and direct contact with a minor despite prior legal warning, effective immediately for a period of 3 years from that day forward. Outside the courtroom, several neighbors who'd attended in quiet support embraced me, some crying, others simply relieved the ordeal had finally reached a formal legal resolution after nearly a full year of escalating fear, financial pressure, and constant uncertainty for my entire household. The financial fraud investigation continued separately, now formally involving the district attorney's office given the scale of forged documents and misappropriated community funds uncovered throughout the extensive 4-year audit period spanning Debbie's entire tenure as HOA president over Maplewood Ridge. Roger's landscaping business, assets still frozen pending investigation, quietly closed its doors within weeks, unable to sustain operations without new contracts while facing mounting legal scrutiny over years of inflated invoices submitted directly to the very community he and his wife had once controlled. Debbie resigned her remaining general HOA membership voting rights voluntarily, though few believed genuine remorse motivated the decision. More likely an attempt to distance herself procedurally before formal criminal charges were potentially filed regarding the forged contract signatures uncovered months earlier. I received a formal letter from the HOA's new interim leadership, led largely by Nadia and 2 other cooperative board members, officially voiding my original lien, refunding every improperly issued fine with interest, and formally apologizing for nearly a year of documented, unwarranted harassment. Mateo asked if this meant the fountain lady was finally gone for good. And for the first time in months, I could answer honestly and completely, yes, she was gone. And we were safe, truly safe, in the home we'd worked so hard to keep. Priya organized a small neighborhood gathering to mark the resolution, though it felt less like celebration and more like collective exhaling. Dozens of families finally free to speak openly about years of quiet fear they'd each privately carried alone before finding each other's support. Nadia was voted in as interim HOA president by unanimous resident approval, a fitting outcome given her courage in finally coming forward despite personal financial vulnerability that had kept her silent for years before deciding the truth mattered more than continued self-protection. The district attorney's office formally announced charges against Debbie for document forgery and financial fraud, and against Roger for related conspiracy charges, based on the extensive documentation compiled through the audit, police investigation, and the collective evidence residents had gathered throughout the ordeal. I felt no particular triumph hearing the announcement, only a quiet, settled relief that the truth had finally been formally recognized, not through luck or dramatic confrontation, but through patient documentation, community solidarity, and the simple refusal to accept fabricated authority as fact. The weeks following the charges felt strangely quiet, an unfamiliar calm after nearly a year of constant tension. I still checked my camera footage each morning out of habit, though increasingly it showed nothing more dramatic than delivery trucks and neighborhood joggers passing by peacefully. Marcus warned me the criminal case would likely take months to resolve, given the complexity of forensic financial evidence and the number of witnesses involved, including Nadia, several board members, and multiple residents who'd experienced retaliatory fines throughout Debbie's 4-year presidency tenure. Debbie's private attorney reportedly attempted an early plea negotiation, offering restitution in exchange for reduced charges, though the district attorney's office indicated the scale of documented fraud, combined with the forged signatures, made leniency unlikely without significant additional cooperation from her. Roger, separately, accepted a plea agreement involving cooperation testimony against Debbie in exchange for reduced conspiracy charges. A decision Priya heard about through her coworker before it became publicly confirmed, causing visible tension reportedly witnessed between the couple outside their own home. I learned through Nadia that Debbie and Roger's marriage had grown strained under the pressure, with neighbors occasionally overhearing raised voices from their property. A stark contrast to the composed, controlled image Debbie had maintained so carefully throughout her years leading the community. Their house, once the pristine centerpiece of the cul-de-sac, began showing subtle signs of neglect. An unwatered lawn, an unclipped hedge, small details that felt symbolically significant to neighbors who'd once feared even minor imperfections under Debbie's relentless, judgmental scrutiny for years. I focused instead on rebuilding normalcy for Mateo, reestablishing routines that had been disrupted throughout the ordeal. Evening bike rides, weekend soccer practice, quiet dinners without the underlying dread of checking the mailbox for another fabricated violation notice waiting inside. Nadia, settling into her interim presidency role, implemented mandatory competitive bidding requirements for all future HOA vendor contracts, along with quarterly public financial disclosures. Structural changes designed specifically to prevent any single individual from ever consolidating unchecked authority again. Several residents proposed renaming the community newsletters Know Your Neighbor section, given its uncomfortable history of subtly targeting dissenting homeowners, replacing it instead with a straightforward maintenance and events update free from personal commentary about individual households or their compliance status. Priya's shared street cameras remained in place by unanimous resident agreement, no longer framed as surveillance against neighbors, but as a genuine community safety measure, a quiet acknowledgement of how vulnerable the neighborhood had become under unchecked, unaccountable leadership for far too long. I received a formal call from Marcus informing me the district attorney intended to call me as a primary witness once the criminal trial date was set. Given my extensive documentation and first-hand experience representing the clearest, most thoroughly recorded pattern of Debbie's conduct, I agreed without hesitation, understanding that testifying wasn't simply about my own resolution anymore, but about ensuring accountability for every family who'd quietly paid unjust fines, sold their homes under pressure, or stayed silent out of fear throughout Debbie's lengthy, unchecked tenure. The trial date was eventually set for early spring, nearly 18 months after the very first invalid driveway violation notice had appeared in my mailbox, a timeline that felt both impossibly long and, given everything uncovered, remarkably fast for justice this thoroughly documented. In the meantime, the financial audit's full findings became publicly available to all residents, revealing the total misappropriated funds exceeded $200,000 across 4 years, a figure that stunned even those who'd suspected wrongdoing throughout Debbie's presidency all along. Several affected families, including the Chens and 2 others who'd previously sold their homes under pressure years earlier, reached out after seeing local coverage of the case, asking whether they too might have grounds to formally join the growing civil complaint against Debbie and Roger. Marcus took on several of these cases pro bono, building a broader civil suit alongside the ongoing criminal proceedings, arguing collectively that Debbie's pattern of retaliatory governance had caused measurable financial and emotional harm extending across numerous households throughout multiple years of unchecked authority. I found myself, almost accidentally, becoming something of a resource for other HOA residents in nearby communities facing similar situations, sharing what I'd learned about bylaws, documentation, and the importance of refusing to accept unverified authority simply because it arrived on official-looking letterhead. Mr. Whose producer cousin eventually did cover the story, though only after the criminal charges were formally filed, framing it less as neighborhood drama and more as a cautionary investigative piece about unchecked HOA power and the importance of financial transparency in community governance. The coverage brought unexpected attention from residents in 3 other counties who recognized eerily similar patterns in their own associations,
prompting several independent local investigations that, while unrelated directly to Maplewood Ridge, trace back conceptually to the same courage it took to first speak up.
Debbie, reportedly, refused all media requests entirely, remaining largely inside her home except for required legal appointments. A stark contrast to the woman who once walked the neighborhood daily with a clipboard, confident in an authority that had finally, thoroughly, collapsed around her. I began preparing formally with Marcus for my testimony, reviewing every document in my binder chronologically, ensuring dates, photographs, and correspondence aligned perfectly with the broader timeline Nadia and the auditor had independently corroborated through official HOA financial and administrative records. Nadia, testifying as well given her insider knowledge, expressed quiet anxiety about facing Debbie directly in court after years of feeling professionally and financially dependent on her former boss's approval, though she remained firmly committed to seeing the truth fully and formally acknowledged. Roger's cooperation agreement required him to testify regarding the forged signatures, confirming under oath that Debbie had personally instructed him to alter contract paperwork after the original board initially rejected Sinclair Landscaping's proposal years earlier, precisely as Nadia's records had indicated. This testimony, once formally entered into pretrial evidence, effectively eliminated any remaining ambiguity about direct intent, transforming what might have been argued as negligent oversight into clearly established, deliberate financial fraud spanning the majority of Debbie's tenure as Community Association president. Debbie's attorney reportedly advised a change of plea given the mounting, corroborated evidence against her, though Debbie herself, according to court filings, resisted this advice for weeks, insisting she still believed a jury would ultimately side with her version of events. I felt a strange, unexpected wave of something almost like sympathy watching her resist reality so completely, understanding perhaps for the first time that her relentless control over the neighborhood had never truly been about property values, but about a deeper, more personal need for power. That sympathy didn't erase what she'd done, the fear she'd instilled in Mateo, the financial stress she'd deliberately caused, or the years other families had quietly suffered before I arrived. But it helped me approach the upcoming trial with clarity rather than lingering personal anger. As the trial date approached, Priya organized one final resident meeting, not about Debbie directly, but about formally establishing new community bylaws, preventing future board members from awarding contracts to family-owned businesses, a change unanimously approved by every household in attendance that evening. Mateo, now more comfortable discussing everything openly, asked if he could come to court someday to see the whole thing get fixed properly. I told him some parts of grown-up problems took time to fully resolve, but that his questions, his resilience, had made me proud throughout. The morning of the trial arrived under a pale gray sky, and I sat in the courtroom hallway with Marcus, binder resting on my knees, feeling the strange calm that comes only after having told the truth so many times it no longer frightens you to repeat it. Debbie entered with her attorney, avoiding eye contact entirely, her composure now brittle rather than commanding. Roger sat several rows back, testifying separately as a cooperating witness, a physical distance from his wife that felt symbolic of everything that had unraveled between them. The prosecution opened by outlining the full scope of the case: forged board signatures, systematically inflated vendor invoices, retaliatory fines against dissenting residents, and a pattern of harassment escalating from paperwork intimidation to direct, documented trespassing and contact with a minor child. I was called to testify on the second day, walking through my binder methodically under Marcus's guidance, presenting each invalid notice, each improperly cited bylaw, and the midnight camera footage showing Debbie herself trespassing on my property months into the original dispute. Debbie's attorney attempted cross-examination, suggesting I'd exaggerated the situation for sympathy or personal gain, but my documentation left little room for interpretation, each claim supported by timestamps, official county records, and footage that spoke far more clearly than any argument could. When asked directly why I hadn't simply paid the fines and avoided conflict like other residents reportedly had for years, I explained calmly that accepting fabricated authority, even quietly, would have meant teaching my son that fear should always outweigh fairness. The courtroom grew very still. Nadia testified next, walking the jury through years of financial records, explaining how she'd initially stayed silent out of financial dependence before ultimately choosing to document everything privately, motivated by growing discomfort watching neighbors suffer under decisions she increasingly recognized as deliberately dishonest. Roger's testimony followed, confirming under oath that Debbie had directly instructed him to alter board approval paperwork years earlier, overriding an initial rejection of his company's bid. A confession that visibly stunned several jurors who'd been quietly evaluating Debbie's earlier composed denials. Debbie's attorney called a character witness, a longtime friend, who described Debbie as deeply committed to community values, though under cross-examination admitted she'd personally received a discounted landscaping quote from Sinclair Landscaping shortly after publicly defending Debbie's leadership decisions the previous year. That admission undercut the defense's broader narrative significantly, suggesting even Debbie's remaining public support had, in some cases, been quietly influenced by the same financial arrangements at the center of the entire fraud case being presented before the jury throughout the trial. The prosecution presented the auditor's full forensic findings on the third day, detailing exactly how invoices had been altered, dates fabricated, and payment approvals routed around normal board review entirely. A presentation so thoroughly documented that even Debbie's attorney seemed visibly resigned. During a recess, I overheard Debbie speaking quietly with her attorney in the hallway, her voice tight with something between anger and disbelief, insisting she'd only ever tried to keep the neighborhood nice. A phrase that felt increasingly hollow given everything presented in court. Closing arguments arrived on the fourth day, the prosecution methodically summarizing 18 months of documented harassment, 4 years of financial fraud, and a clear pattern demonstrating deliberate abuse of community authority for personal and financial gain at the direct expense of trusting residents. The defense's closing argument focused primarily on Debbie's years of volunteer service to the community, attempting to frame the case as an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than deliberate wrongdoing, a framing that felt increasingly disconnected from the overwhelming documented evidence presented throughout the trial. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours before reaching a verdict. A relatively short deliberation given the complexity of financial evidence. suggesting the documented pattern had left little genuine doubt about intent, deliberateness, and the sustained harm caused throughout the ordeal. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts of document forgery and financial fraud, guilty on the harassment charges tied directly to the restraining order violations preceding formal filing, the courtroom remained quiet, the weight of the moment settling rather than erupting. Debbie's expression shifted from disbelief to something quieter, almost hollow, as the verdict was formally entered into record. Her attorney placed a hand briefly on her shoulder, though she didn't react, staring straight ahead at nothing in particular for several long moments. Roger, given his cooperation agreement, received a significantly reduced sentence involving probation and mandatory restitution payments, while Debbie faced substantial prison time alongside a court-ordered restitution obligation covering the full scope of misappropriated community funds identified throughout the audit process. I felt no triumphant rush walking out of the courthouse that afternoon. Only a steady, grounded relief, the kind that comes not from revenge, but from watching a system, however slow and imperfect, ultimately affirm the simple truth I documented patiently for nearly 2 years. Marcus reminded me outside the courthouse that this outcome hadn't happened by luck, but by consistent documentation, calm persistence, and a willingness to keep gathering truth even when the process felt exhausting, isolating, and, at certain points, genuinely frightening for my entire family. Priya met me in the parking lot with Matteo, who ran over immediately asking if it was really over now. I knelt down, held him close, and told him yes, truly was, and that doing the right thing, even when it's hard, had finally, fully worked. News of the verdict spread quickly through the neighborhood group chat, met with a wave of relief rather than celebration, a recognition that justice, even when deserved, rarely felt like victory so much as the quiet, long overdue closing of a painful, exhausting chapter. Nadia, still serving as interim HOA president, sent a formal community message the next morning, confirming the verdict and outlining continued structural reforms already underway to prevent any future concentration of unchecked power within the association's leadership going forward permanently. Debbie's sentencing hearing was scheduled for several weeks later, giving both sides time to prepare victim impact statements, several of which came not just from me, but from other residents finally ready to formally describe years of quiet financial and emotional harm they'd endured. At sentencing, the judge specifically cited the forged signatures and the direct contact with a minor child as aggravating factors, ultimately imposing a sentence reflecting both the financial scale of the fraud and the sustained, deliberate harassment documented throughout the extensive court proceedings. Debbie was sentenced to 4 years in state prison, followed by an extended probation period, along with a court-ordered restitution obligation requiring repayment of the full misappropriated funds to the Maplewood Ridge HOA and affected residents over a structured multi-year timeline. Roger received 2 years of supervised probation along with his own restitution obligations, a lighter sentence directly tied to his cooperation testimony. Though he lost his contractor's license permanently following a separate state licensing board review triggered by the criminal case's findings. Their house, the once pristine centerpiece of the cul-de-sac, went up for sale within months, purchased eventually by a young family who, ironically, had no idea about the property's history until Priya, laughing gently, filled them in during a welcome visit shortly after moving in. I sometimes drove past that house afterward, the fountain quiet, the hedges slowly regrown into a softer, more natural shape under new ownership. A small, visual reminder that even the most rigidly controlled facades eventually give way to something more honest and unguarded.
Mateo,
Now well into middle school, rarely mentioned the ordeal anymore, though occasionally he'd bring it up thoughtfully, asking questions about fairness, authority, and why some people mistake control for genuine leadership. Questions I answered as honestly as I could each time. The Maplewood Ridge community, under Nadia's continued leadership, implemented permanent structural safeguards, mandatory competitive bidding, quarterly public audits, and a clear resident appeals process for any violation notice. Changes born directly from nearly 2 years of collective, hard-earned experience. I received a formal letter from the state's Community Association Regulatory Division, confirming Maplewood Ridge had passed its first full transparency review under the new leadership structure. A small but meaningful marker of how far the community had come since those first invalid notices. Several of the families who'd sold their homes years earlier under pressure eventually received partial restitution payments through the structured court settlement.
A small measure of justice arriving late, but arriving nonetheless, for households who'd once assumed their experiences would simply be forgotten.
Priya and I remained close afterward. Our friendship forged largely through shared documentation folders and late-night worried phone calls, now instead filled with lighter conversations about weekend plans, Mateo's school projects, and the simple, previously uncertain pleasure of an uneventful, peaceful evening. Marcus later told me our case had become something of a reference point among community association attorneys in the state, cited occasionally in training. Materials about recognizing and properly documenting retaliatory HOA governance patterns before they escalate into full financial or personal harm. I never set out to become anyone's cautionary tale or inspiration, only to protect my home and my son from something that initially seemed too petty to take seriously, yet ultimately revealed itself as a genuinely dangerous abuse of quiet, unquestioned community authority. Looking back, the driveway had never truly mattered at all. Not the staining, not the pressure washing, not even the fabricated violation notice that started everything. It had simply been the first available excuse for someone determined to exert control over anyone who didn't fully submit. What mattered, in the end, wasn't the driveway, but the folder I built one document at a time. The neighbors who eventually found the courage to speak alongside me, and the quiet, steady refusal to accept fabricated authority simply because it arrived on official letterhead. Nadia and I occasionally meet for coffee now, an unlikely friendship built from an unlikely alliance, formed in the middle of what once felt like an impossible, isolating fight against something far larger than either of us initially understood we were truly facing together. The HOA newsletter, redesigned entirely under new leadership, now features genuinely useful community information, pool hours, volunteer opportunities, local school updates, nothing resembling the subtle, targeted commentary that once quietly punished anyone who dared question unchecked authority within Maplewood Ridge. Mateo's soccer team won their division championship that spring, and standing on the sidelines cheering, surrounded by neighbors who'd once been strangers bound only by shared fear, I realized how completely our sense of community had been rebuilt from something genuinely healthier and fairer. I kept the original binder, tucked safely in a closet now, not out of lingering anger, but as a quiet reminder of exactly how much patient documentation, calm persistence, and community solidarity could ultimately accomplish against even the most confidently entrenched abuse of authority. Debbie occasionally sent formal, court-monitored restitution updates through her attorney, brief and impersonal, a stark contrast to the woman who once photographed my trash bins at midnight, convinced her authority extended far beyond anything the actual recorded bylaws had ever truly granted her. I heard, secondhand through Priya, that Debbie had reportedly told a fellow inmate she still believed she'd simply been protecting property values. A statement that, more than anything else throughout the entire ordeal, revealed just how completely she'd convinced herself of her own fabricated authority. Roger relocated out of state after his probation began, starting over quietly in a different industry entirely, his landscaping license permanently revoked. His once thriving business now simply another cautionary footnote within the broader, thoroughly documented Maplewood Ridge financial fraud case. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd simply paid that first fabricated fine quietly, the way so many families before me apparently had for years. I suspect Debbie would still be walking the neighborhood with her clipboard, confident, unquestioned, and entirely unaccountable. Instead, a folder full of time-stamped documentation, a handful of brave neighbors, and a refusal to accept unearned authority ultimately dismantled nearly 5 years of quiet, systemic abuse hidden behind polished landscaping, official letterhead, and a carefully maintained fountain at the top of the street. The community garden, a project Nadia championed shortly after taking over leadership, opened later that year on a small plot near the entrance, tended collectively by residents who'd once been too afraid to speak openly with one another about anything beyond weather and lawn care. Standing at the garden's opening ceremony, watching Mateo help plant tomato seedlings alongside kids from families I'd only recently gotten to truly know, I felt something settle permanently inside me, a sense that Maplewood Ridge had finally become the community it always should have been. I still keep my exterior cameras installed, not out of lingering fear, but simple, reasonable caution learned the hard way. A small, permanent reminder that even peaceful neighborhoods require ordinary people willing to document truth and stand together when something quietly begins to feel wrong. Priya likes to joke now that our street should install a small plaque near the old fountain house, commemorating the driveway that started it all. And though I always laugh it off, some quiet part of me thinks she isn't entirely wrong to suggest it. These days, my driveway stays clean simply because I like it that way, not out of fear, not out of compliance with fabricated rules, but because it's my home, earned and protected, standing quietly at the end of a street finally free from unchecked, quiet tyranny. The restitution payments, arriving in structured quarterly installments, gradually restored the HOA's Community Reserve Fund, allowing long-delayed improvements, like resurfaced sidewalks and updated playground equipment that residents had been told, for years, simply weren't in the budget under previous leadership. I filed my own final restitution claim quietly, less concerned with the modest financial amount than with the formal, documented closure it represented. A final line item marking the true, official end of an ordeal that had once threatened everything I'd worked to build. Mateo, now taller and steadier than the anxious boy who once asked if he'd get in trouble for a helmet strap, occasionally mentions wanting to study law someday. Inspired, he says, by watching his mother refuse to accept unfairness simply because it arrived with official authority attached. Life in Maplewood Ridge settled into something genuinely peaceful. Ordinary weekend barbecues, Kids riding bikes freely past the old fountain house without anyone stopping to question helmet straps. Neighbors greeting each other honestly rather than cautiously. Finally free from years of quiet, unspoken fear. I think often about how close I came to simply paying that first fabricated fine and moving on quietly, and how differently everything might have unfolded for dozens of families if fear had quietly won instead of patient. Documented truth finally, fully prevailing. In the end, it was never really about a driveway, or pressure washing, or even one woman's need for control. It was about what happens when ordinary people, tired but determined, refuse to let fabricated authority go unquestioned. One document, one witness, one quiet act of courage at a time. Maplewood Ridge stands today as a stronger, fairer community, rebuilt not by dramatic confrontation, but by patient persistence, honest documentation, and neighbors who finally chose solidarity over silence, proving that even the most confidently entrenched abuse of power eventually meets its reckoning. And every time I pull into my own clean, quiet driveway now, I remember exactly what it cost to protect it, and exactly why it was always completely worth the fight.